I saw my wife's boss kiss her during a business dinner, and in that instant, something inside me shattered forever. There was no scream, no scandal. Just the icy certainty that whatever existed between us was over right there, before my eyes. I felt the ground slip away, but I stood firm. I took a few steps into the room, and when she saw me, her eyes widened, her face paled, her hands trembled slightly. I said nothing. I just turned and walked away, feeling a heavy silence follow me to the car. When I got home, I packed her bags with almost surgical precision, as if each item of clothing were further proof of what she had destroyed. I placed everything outside and left a short, direct, definitive note on the suitcase: "I wish you happiness, but we can no longer continue as a couple." When she arrived, there was no argument. Just a quick glance, an immediate understanding. She knew why. She gathered her things in silence and left for her mother's house. And I stood there, alone, breathing the heavy air of a home that was no longer a home, feeling the bitter taste of a love that had been thrown away as if it were worth nothing. Time passed, and she followed the path she had chosen. Her lover, who at first seemed so certain, so secure, led her to believe that her future lay there. They began to show themselves together, frequenting places that had once been ours, smiling for photos that seemed staged, trying to display a happiness that, to those who knew how to look, seemed more like a pose than a truth. She bet everything on that relationship, believing she had exchanged a lukewarm love for an overwhelming passion. But it didn't take long for her to discover she was alone in a story that was only important to her. He left her as easily as he had won her over. They traded her for another woman, a younger, more convenient employee, perhaps more useful to his interests. For him, it had all been nothing more than a game, a temporary diversion. For her, it had been a life choice. And that was when the real weight of the decision fell on her shoulders. She had exchanged something true, solid, and lasting for someone else's whim, fleeting and cruel. As she sank into the silence of someone left behind, I continued, step by step, rebuilding my life. At first, it was just survival. The days were long, the nights endless. Every corner of the house held her shadow. The scent on the pillow took weeks to fade. Her favorite cup sat in the cupboard for months until one day, without realizing it, I threw it away. I learned to cook for one, to watch movies alone, to come home without waiting for anyone at the door. I didn't seek revenge, I didn't think about retribution. I just wanted to stop feeling. And it was through this slow process that I began to realize that her absence no longer hurt as it once did. It was just an empty space, a silence that no longer bothered me. I grew accustomed to it. She, on the other hand, began to appear wherever I was, perhaps by coincidence, perhaps not. At first, we avoided all contact. But our eyes would meet, and there was something in them, a silent apology, an acknowledgement of guilt, a memory that wouldn't completely die. I pretended not to notice. Until one day, after months without exchanging a word, she found me in the middle of the street. She stopped in front of me, and with a choked voice said, "I need to talk to you." I looked at her, unhurriedly, without anger, simply with a calm I hadn't even known I possessed. "We have nothing more to talk about." But she insisted. She said she needed to ask for forgiveness, that she needed to look me in the eyes and acknowledge the harm she had done. I remained silent for a few seconds, and when I finally spoke, the words came out clean, without rancor, "I've already forgiven you." She took a deep breath, perhaps hoping this was an invitation to start over. But I added, "But we can't go back. The man who loved you like that doesn't exist anymore." The impact of my words fell on her like a weight, forcing her to look away. There were no exaggerated tears, no screams, just that dense silence of someone who understands they've lost something they'll never get back. She tried to smile, as if accepting the sentence, but the smile quickly faded. He just nodded and said, "I understand." And he left. I stood there, watching her walk away, thinking about how a love can die not in a scream or a fight, but in a simple, almost banal instant, when you realize what existed no longer fits in the present. And the truth is, I didn't hate her in that moment. I just felt a strange compassion. Because I knew she would carry that for the rest of her life. The certainty that she held in her hands a love that could have been forever, but exchanged it for something that didn't last at all. On her birthday, months after that meeting, for the first time in all the years since we'd known each other, I didn't text, call, or send a single message. It wasn't out of anger, it was simply because I hadn't really thought about her that day. I was too busy living my life. And perhaps that was the hardest blow for her, realizing that the space she'd occupied in my heart had been closed forever. There was no hurt, just absence. A definitive void. She, however, never stopped remembering. Never stopped imagining what it would have been like if she had made different choices. I followed, she was trapped. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest consequence of all. Because time doesn't stop, but for some, it becomes a prison. And she was trapped the moment she saw me enter that restaurant, the moment she realized I knew everything, the moment she chose to follow a different path, believing it was better. I sometimes wonder if she imagined that one day I might forgive her and, along with forgiveness, open the door again for her to return. Maybe so. But what she never imagined, is what happened next. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is accepted or romanticized. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, created to clearly and intensely show how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes feelings, and leaves lasting scars. Get ready, because now you're about to hear a shocking story, the kind that lingers in your mind long after the end. The night air carried a gentle coolness as the city lights slowly came on, reflecting in the windows of the buildings like tiny golden fragments. Daniel walked beside Laura through the quiet streets of their neighborhood, feeling the pleasant weight of the routine they had built together. They had been married for 8 years, but they had known each other for over a decade, ever since they met by chance in a small cafe on a rainy day that had become, for both of them, a silent milestone. Since then, their lives had been shaped by each other's presence, creating a fabric of memories, projects, and promises that seemed too solid to unravel. He worked in financial consulting, always meticulous with schedules and commitments, someone who found comfort in planning. Laura, on the other hand, had a spontaneous energy, capable of transforming ordinary days into small adventures. She was the type who would suggest dinner out on any given Tuesday, or show up with an improvised cake just to celebrate being alive. They were, at first glance, complementary. The balance between his predictability and her lightness seemed perfect. The house where they lived was a reflection of their union, light-colored walls, paintings hand-picked during travels, and simple yet meaningful furniture. In the living room, a comfortable sofa where they spent long evenings watching old movies, and in the kitchen, a wooden table served as a stage for long dinners, filled with conversations that ranged from trivial matters to dreams for the future. Daniel was proud to have made that place a home, not only with his work, but with the care they both put into every detail. Neighbors knew them as a friendly and polite couple, always present at small gatherings on the street. When they walked together, it was common to see smiles and waves from those who saw them as a harmonious couple. Daniel had a smaller circle of friends, men with whom he shared conversations about sports and the job market, but who rarely became deeply involved in his personal life. Laura, by her communicative nature, seemed to always be surrounded by people. However, their marriage was never marked by excessive jealousy or distrust. There was a silent pact of trust between them, as if they both knew the foundation of their relationship was solid enough to withstand personality differences. She admired the way he remained calm in the face of problems, and he was captivated by the way she could brighten even the darkest days. Daniel's job was demanding, often involving meetings that stretched into the wee hours. Laura, meanwhile, worked in the administrative department of a mid-sized company, dealing daily with fast-paced demands and a relatively young team. Even with differing schedules, they always found time to reconnect. He often arrived home to find the smell of dinner wafting through the kitchen as she greeted him with a tired but genuine smile. On weekends, they sought to disconnect from their responsibilities. Sometimes they traveled to nearby cities, sometimes simply spending the day at home, indulging in laziness and long conversations. On their wedding anniversaries, they created their own ritual, choosing a new restaurant to try, dressing up as if it were a first date, and spending the evening reminiscing about their best moments together. It was during these dinners that they often reinforced the importance they placed on the story they were building. Daniel believed their marriage was the result not only of love, but of their daily efforts to keep alive something that, over time, could easily become routine. Laura said he was her safe haven, someone she could trust unconditionally. This constant exchange of reassurance made them feel they were on the right path. Still, as in any long-standing relationship, there were small, almost imperceptible cracks, details that were rarely discussed but remained there, silent. Daniel, always so focused, would sometimes immerse himself so much in his work that he became absent even when present. Laura, on the other hand, had a need for attention and novelty that, at times, seemed greater than he could offer. These differences, while not glaring, formed a backdrop that could eventually become more evident. But to the outsider, they were simply a mature couple, with common challenges and an admirable bond. One day, Laura received an email invitation to a formal event. It was an important business dinner, attended by influential people, a moment she saw as an opportunity to strengthen her professional image. She mentioned it to Daniel over breakfast, explaining that it would be an elegant evening, with speeches and possibly networking opportunities. He smiled, encouraging her to go, saying he knew how much these occasions meant to her career. There was no room for insecurity in that conversation, only the natural encouragement of those who want the best for each other. The days leading up to the event were uneventful. Daniel was immersed in a demanding project, while Laura dedicated herself to preparing her personal appearance for the evening. She bought a new dress, carefully selected her accessories, and paid a visit to the salon. On the morning of the dinner, she seemed excited, exchanging messages with co-workers about the organization and details of the event. He, despite being busy, sent a message wishing her a good time and that everything went as planned. This mutual trust had been cemented over the years. They believed that, despite their differences, there was an implicit commitment to loyalty. This allowed each of them to have their own professional and social lives without the need for excessive control or demands. This freedom, however, was also a silent test, an invisible proof that the bonds between them were strong enough to withstand distance, separate commitments, and the small choices they made every day. That week, the house was particularly quiet. Daniel spent long hours at the office, arriving home late into the night. Laura, for her part, seemed busier than usual, immersed in preparing reports and meetings. Despite the rush, they still maintained their rituals, a quick dinner together, a bedtime chat, a goodnight kiss. These were simple gestures, but they maintained a sense of closeness. Laura was discussing the event she was attending with some enthusiasm. Although she had said it would be a formal dinner, Daniel found nothing unusual about it. She had attended similar events before and always returned with intriguing stories about the conversations, the dishes served, and the interesting people she met. He enjoyed listening to these stories, imagining her interacting confidently in a sophisticated setting. Nothing, absolutely nothing, that night indicated that their lives were about to take a completely different path. Until that moment, they were just two people following the normal course of a long-term marriage, with their routines, their small differences, their dreams still intertwined. What Daniel didn't know was that, in a few hours, something would happen that would forever change the way he viewed the woman he loved and the story they had built together. The day of the dinner arrived shrouded in a strangely calm atmosphere. Daniel had spent the morning taking care of matters at the office, trying to get everything in order so he could return home early, but the barrage of emails and phone calls was relentless. Laura, for her part, was preparing herself with the attention of someone who understands that details matter. She chose the dress she had bought days before, an elegant shade that highlighted her eyes and gave her an air of sophistication. She spent hours at the salon, applying delicate makeup and carefully styling her hair, as if the evening were more than just a corporate event. Daniel noticed the energy she exuded, an almost youthful enthusiasm, and complimented her before rushing off to work. She smiled and thanked him, but there was something in her gaze that he couldn't immediately decipher. That night, he arrived home to find the room silent. Her perfume still lingered in the air, a sweet trail that seemed to spread throughout the rooms. The dress she'd worn the night before hung carefully behind the bedroom door, a reminder that this space was shared by two lives that, at that moment, followed different agendas. He sat on the sofa and turned on the television, but his concentration was unsettling. It was as if there was a background noise in his thoughts, a restlessness for no apparent reason. He tried to push the feeling away, telling himself it was just fatigue. In the middle of the night, while reviewing some documents, he received a message from a colleague asking for help with an urgent matter downtown. He hesitated, but knew it was something he couldn't put off until the next day. He grabbed his car keys and left, the night air bringing a mixture of freshness and strange anxiety. On the way, as he stopped at a traffic light near a hotel where large events were being held, he noticed a flurry of activity at the entrance. Lights, laughter, and excited voices echoed on the sidewalk. It was then that his gaze caught a familiar silhouette, that posture he knew better than any other. Laura was there, standing with an elegant group, laughing with the casual ease of someone at ease. Beside her, an older man, in an impeccable suit and a confident expression, stood too close, as if there was an intimacy between them that belied a professional context. Daniel parked his car a little further away, watching from a distance. He tried to convince himself it was just a friendly gesture, perhaps a result of the relaxed atmosphere of the event, but the man's hand resting slowly and surely on her back made his stomach churn. He entered the lobby as if looking for someone by chance, but his eyes were fixed on the two of them. Laura didn't immediately notice him. He approached slowly, passing by the guests, her heart racing at an irregular pace. When she finally saw him, her eyes widened, as if in disbelief. The man beside her stepped back discreetly, as if caught in a moment he'd rather keep hidden. Daniel said nothing. He just stood there, staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and silent pain. The tension between them was palpable. The guests around them seemed unaware, but within that small circle of gazes, time had stopped. Laura stepped forward, opened her mouth to say something, but he was already moving away, crossing the lobby with firm strides. There was no rush, but there was a weight in each movement, as if carrying the crumbling of years of history on his shoulders. He stepped out into the cool night air, breathing deeply, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions that threatened to overflow. The drive home was silent, almost automatic. Upon arriving, Daniel walked straight into the room, opened the closet, and began removing her clothes with methodical movements. There was no explosive anger, just a cold determination, as if he were carrying out an inevitable task. The clothes were folded and placed in the suitcase with precision, along with shoes, perfumes, and personal items. When finished, he placed everything outside, by the door, and on the suitcase, he left a simple note, without long explanations, just enough to let her know that this chapter was over. Minutes later, she heard footsteps approaching. The door opened, and she appeared, her face marked by a mixture of surprise and fear. Her eyes searched his, but Daniel remained motionless, his hands in his pockets, his expression grim. She looked at the suitcase, then at the note, and didn't ask any questions. There was a silent understanding that any words would be useless. With slow movements, she gathered her belongings and left, without turning around. The door closed, and silence once again filled the space. That night was long. Daniel lay awake, sitting on the couch, staring into space. Images of the scene at the hotel came back over and over again, every detail etched like a scar. The touch on his waist, the easy laugh, the surprised look upon seeing him, it all blended into a profound sense of loss and disbelief. There were no screams or tears, just a cold emptiness that seemed to expand within him. In the following days, life took on a strange tone. Her messages began arriving, short messages asking to talk, but he didn't respond. Mutual friends began discreetly asking if everything was okay, and he simply said he needed some time. Laura settled in at her mother's house, while the man who had been by her side that night disappeared from conversations and photos. Daniel, for his part, maintained his work routine, but the nights were heavy, marked by a silence that seemed to scream. Even so, something inside him was beginning to regroup. His initial anger gave way to a bitter calm, and that calm would soon transform into a clarity he hadn't expected to find so soon. Because, although the betrayal had been exposed that night, there was still something hidden, a truth she carried that, when it came to light, would forever change the way he viewed not only what had happened, but everything they had experienced together. And that revelation was yet to come. The encounter happened weeks later, on a cloudy late afternoon, when the streets seemed bathed in a pale, melancholy light. Daniel didn't look for her, but she found a way to intercept him outside a cafe. She looked different, more haggard, her hair tied back haphazardly, her face devoid of the same life it had been before. He watched her approach with hesitant steps, as if carrying an unbearable weight and fearing the ground might collapse beneath them. For a moment, he considered simply continuing to walk, but something in her gaze, a mix of urgency and fragility, made him stop. She took a deep breath before saying, her voice trembling, that she needed to talk, that there were things he deserved to know. Daniel remained silent, waiting for her to continue. They walked to a bench in a quiet square, the distant sound of cars mingling with the rapid beating of her heart. Laura looked at her hands, avoiding his gaze, and began to speak. She said that after that night in the hotel, she had tried to move on with the life she imagined she would have with the other man, but that she soon realized nothing was as it seemed. He didn't treat her as someone important, just as disposable company. The moment she found herself alone, without the husband she had betrayed and without the lover she had chosen, was all too quick. But that, she explained, wasn't the real reason she had sought out Daniel. The real reason was something else, something she had been harboring since long before everything fell apart. When she finally raised her eyes to face him, there were unshed tears, but also a strange determination. She said that, months before the betrayal, at a time when Daniel was working non-stop, she felt neglected, invisible. Instead of talking, she allowed herself to be drawn into a gradual bond with that man, a friendship that gradually became something more. But what Daniel didn't know, and what she had never had the courage to say, was that that man had always known intimate details about their lives, things that could only have come from her. In seemingly innocent conversations, she revealed information that Daniel considered inviolable: financial decisions, career plans, difficulties she faced at work, personal insecurities she had confided only to her. All of this, she now admitted, had been used by the other to manipulate situations to his advantage. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the physical betrayal, it wasn't just the image of her with another man. It was the complete breaking of a silent pact that sustained their marriage: loyalty. He clenched his fists, controlling his breathing, and asked, in a low tone, if she was aware of what she had done. She answered yes, but at the time she hadn't realized the full extent of it. She said her lover made her feel heard, valued, and that, without realizing it, she began to tell him more and more, until the line between confidence and betrayal blurred. Daniel held her gaze, and in that gaze there was no longer explosive anger, only an emptiness that hurt more than any scream. She tried to justify herself, saying she believed he, Daniel, wouldn't mind so much, that she hadn't imagined the information would affect him. But now, seeing him before her, she understood the depth of the wound she had inflicted. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if needing air to process what he had just heard. Then he asked, in a firm voice, if the other man was still looking for her. Laura shook her head, explaining that he had replaced her with another woman without hesitation, that all his interest had been just a game, a way to gain advantage and have fun at the same time. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Laura wiped away a tear that escaped and said she wasn't looking for an apology, but for forgiveness. She didn't want him to harbor hatred in his heart, and more than that, she wanted him to know that, despite everything, she still loved him. Daniel smiled slightly, a sad smile, and replied that forgiveness was already there, that there was no more room for resentment within him. However, she made it clear that the man who had loved her unconditionally was no longer there. She explained that by breaking that bond of trust, she had not only destroyed their marriage but also a part of him that would never be the same again. Laura lowered her head, absorbing every word. She tried to argue that they could rebuild something new, that perhaps time would help, but Daniel was blunt. Time doesn't rebuild something broken this way. He said he would move on, that he wanted her to find peace, but that he could offer nothing but forgiveness. The weight of reality fell hard on her. There was no second chance, no going back. Only the knowledge that she had traded something irreplaceable for a fleeting moment. They stood there for a few minutes, without speaking. As he stood, Daniel wished her luck and turned to leave. Laura sat, watching him walk away, feeling that each step he took was a door closing. And in that moment, she understood that the true punishment wasn't the judgment of others or immediate loneliness, but the knowledge that she had forever lost the only true love in her life. The wind was beginning to pick up, dragging dry leaves along the sidewalk as Daniel crossed the street and walked away from the square, leaving Laura behind. He didn't look back once, but the feeling that her footsteps had stopped in place followed him like a shadow. He continued walking to a nearby taxi stand and asked to be taken to a park he used to visit before he got married, a quiet place with a small lake and ancient trees, where he liked to collect his thoughts. He sat on a wooden bench and let his body relax, but his mind was constantly racing. Her words, her confession, her almost pleading tone, all of it still reverberated, not with surprise, but with the weight of what it confirmed. There was an abyss that nothing could bridge. Meanwhile, Laura walked slowly back to her mother's house. Each corner seemed longer than the last. In her head, the conversations they just exchanged replayed, but now with a different echo, as if she were watching her own downfall from the outside. Entering the living room, her mother noticed her daughter's condition and tried to ask what had happened, but Laura merely shook her head, went upstairs, and closed the door. There, alone, she stared at her reflection in the mirror and realized what she looked like. Her heavy gaze, her pale skin, the weary expression of someone who'd lost something she doesn't know how to get back. At the park, Daniel got up and began walking along the stone path that skirted the lake. He ran into a longtime friend, someone he hadn't seen in months, and he inevitably accepted the invitation to sit and chat. Sensing something was amiss, the friend asked if everything was okay. Daniel didn't elaborate, simply saying that life had changed a lot in the last few months. The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but the exchange, even superficial, brought a strange sense of freedom, as if, for the first time in a long time, he was speaking without having to mince words to protect someone. The next morning, Laura decided to look for Daniel again, but this time not to beg. She wanted to return some items he had left with her at the beginning of their separation. She called to ask if she could stop by, and he said he'd be available later that afternoon. When she arrived, she found him organizing books on the shelf. The mood was different from the previous day. There was no immediate tension, but there was also no closeness. She handed him a small box containing her belongings and stood there, watching him place it on the table without opening it. The silence felt like a minefield. Laura then asked to sit down, and he agreed. She said she didn't want to go on for too long, but she needed to thank him for listening to everything in the square without interrupting, without humiliating her, even though he had every reason to. Daniel, with a slight nod, replied that listening was the least he could do, since at some point he, too, had believed they would be side by side until the end. She tried to bring up a topic that wouldn't be painful, asking about work and how his social life was going. Daniel responded in short sentences, but without harshness. There was, however, a trace of distance that was impossible to ignore. When she mentioned that she'd considered going back to school to occupy her time and mind, he simply said he thought it was a good idea. Laura smiled almost imperceptibly, but the expression quickly faded. Then, without realizing it, she blurted out something she hadn't planned to say, that she'd seen a photo of him at a recent birthday party, next to a woman she didn't know. The comment hung in the air, and after a brief pause, he confirmed that he'd started seeing someone. It wasn't a declaration, no provocation intended, but to Laura, the information felt like a door slamming shut. She took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in her voice. She said she hadn't expected him to be alone, but that hearing that made her realize, definitively, that the place she once held in his life no longer existed. Daniel, unfazed, replied that every choice carries weight, and that they were both simply living with the consequences of their own decisions. Laura lowered her gaze, nodded, and remained silent for a few moments before getting up to leave. At the door, she turned and said she hoped he would be happy, no matter what. He simply thanked her and closed the door slowly, as if to preserve the calm of that moment. The following days were different for both of them. Daniel began going out more often, meeting new people, rediscovering simple pleasures he'd neglected. Laura, on the other hand, immersed herself in a silent process of reflection, reviewing choices, analyzing moments that had previously gone unnoticed. His absence wasn't just physical, it was an emotional void impossible to fill. She began to realize that it wasn't just about missing his presence, but about missing the person she was when she was with him. A few weeks later, they passed by chance in a bookstore. Daniel was browsing a book, and when he looked up, he saw Laura standing in the opposite aisle. The encounter was unexpected for both of them. She greeted him with a shy smile, and he returned it with warmth. They chatted briefly about their readings and recent releases, but the conversation, though civil, was full of unspoken subtext. As they said goodbye, Laura felt as if there was an invisible wall between them, a wall that could not be climbed, only respected. On the way home, she thought that this might be the last time she'd see him so closely, and this thought brought her a mixture of sadness and acceptance. Daniel, for his part, upon returning home, noticed that there was no longer that pressure in his chest he used to feel whenever he passed her. There was only a distant recognition, almost like when you meet someone who was once an important part of your life but now belongs to another time, another chapter. Their story, despite having ended, remained alive in their memories, but it no longer shaped their days. Each, in their own way, was learning to walk without looking back, even if, at times, the past insisted on knocking on the door of their memory. Laura knew she would never erase the mistakes made, and Daniel knew he would never erase the scars left. But, at that point, they both understood that what remained was to move forward, albeit on completely different paths. The week after their reunion at the bookstore brought a strange shift in Daniel's view of the past. It was no longer about dwelling on what had happened, but about understanding more broadly what that relationship had truly been, what was solid and what, from the beginning, had been sustained by silent illusions. He didn't deny the love, but he was beginning to see how, at times, they had both become too complacent, leaving spaces where distance had crept in unnoticed. The betrayal and the secrecy had been the breaking point, but now, with the dust settling, he began to reflect on what he would do from then on, not only with Laura but also with how he would conduct any future relationship. Laura, on the other hand, was living a dilemma that ate away at her from the inside out. She knew she couldn't undo what she'd done, but she also felt an almost desperate need to try to prove she'd learned something from her mistake. However, she couldn't find a way that wouldn't feel invasive or disrespectful of Daniel's decision to move on. At night, alone, she would mentally replay every conversation they'd had since their separation, searching for a sign, however small, that perhaps some connection might still exist. But the more she reflected, the more she realized that what tormented her wasn't just his absence, but the knowledge that she'd lost her own identity by allowing a momentary choice to define her entire life from then on. Daniel, without realizing it, also found himself facing a dilemma. He had met someone else, someone with whom he was beginning to build something new, but he felt cautious. At times, the memory of what had happened with Laura surfaced like a silent warning, reminding him that trust is something that is built slowly but destroyed in seconds. At the same time, he knew he couldn't carry ghosts from the past into the present, as that would be a way of remaining trapped in what was already over. So he began to police himself to prevent unfounded comparisons or distrust from infiltrating his new interactions. The moral dilemma that was emerging was more complex than either of them imagined. Laura struggled to accept that, even if forgiven, she wouldn't have the place she once held back, and Daniel struggled to accept that, even moving on, he couldn't completely erase the scar he bore. In inevitable social gatherings, when they saw each other from afar, there was a silent exchange of glances that blended understanding and resignation. Neither of them sought the other out, but their presence was felt, and that was enough to remind both of them that, no matter how far apart they grew, a part of history would continue to connect them invisibly. One afternoon, Daniel was invited to lunch at a friend's house, and upon arriving, he noticed that Laura was also among the guests. The surprise was tempered by their impeccable politeness. They sat on opposite sides of the table, talking only enough to maintain cordiality. But as the others laughed and exchanged stories, Daniel realized how much of a test the situation was for everyone involved. Her presence no longer bothered him as it once had, but there was a constant awareness that every gesture, every word, carried a subtext that others might not perceive. After lunch, as they said goodbye, Laura approached and said, in a low voice, that she was trying to find a purpose that didn't revolve around what she'd lost. Daniel responded with only an, "I know," but that brief exchange left a strange feeling in the air, as if they both recognized that life would go on, but that there was still something unresolved internally, not between them as a couple, but between each of them and their own conscience. In the days that followed, Laura began volunteering at an institution that helped people in vulnerable situations. She didn't tell Daniel, but the change in her routine began to transform her. She found meaning there beyond guilt, a reason to wake up and occupy her mind. Still, no matter how dedicated she was, there were times when she wondered if part of her motivation wasn't unconsciously trying to become someone he could respect again, even without any chance of reconciliation. Daniel, in turn, intensified his contact with the woman he was getting to know. They began hanging out more often, sharing stories, and making small weekend plans. At times, he felt a slight insecurity, as if he were stepping onto terrain that was still testing his strength, but he decided he wouldn't let the past stop him from experiencing something good. He began to realize that starting over didn't mean forgetting, but learning to live with what was left behind, without letting it dictate his next steps. This period marked a turning point for both of them. Laura accepted, with growing clarity, that the forgiveness she had received was not an open door to return, but a gesture of liberation allowing each of them to follow their own path. Daniel, on the other hand, felt he was approaching a decisive moment, where he would have to choose whether to continue maintaining any emotional ties, even distant ones, or to sever any remaining bonds once and for all. The future, though uncertain, was beginning to take shape, and every choice made in that moment would shape what came next. The weight of what they had experienced still loomed large, but now not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a constant reminder that decisions, once made, carry consequences that cannot be undone. And, amid this awareness, each prepared, in their own way, for what lay ahead, unaware that the next step would bring the most decisive moment since their separation. The days dragged on in an atmosphere of silent change, as if something in the air announced that their lives were about to take a step from which there would be no turning back. Daniel had delved deeper into the relationship he was building with the new woman in his life, but he wasn't rushing anything. He got to know her slowly, without the urge to fill empty spaces, and this made him realize he was different from years ago. This time, he avoided idealizations, didn't create unreasonable expectations, and didn't let himself be carried away by the impulse of feeling. He had learned to observe, to understand the signs, to appreciate what emerged without trying to mold the other person to his own liking. Still, there were moments when, alone, he reflected on how life can change direction so quickly and how it's possible to rebuild after seeing everything fall apart. Laura, on the other hand, was increasingly involved in volunteer work, finding it a way to occupy her time and push away her heavier thoughts. She encountered stories that touched her deeply, situations that made her understand that her own pain, though great, was not the only one in the world. This awareness gradually transformed her, making her more patient and, in a way, more aware of her actions. Even so, there was something that wouldn't go away, the need to have one last conversation with Daniel, not to change what had already been decided, but to finally close any room for misunderstanding, so that they could both move forward without doubt about their feelings. This opportunity arose unexpectedly. One Saturday afternoon, during a charity event, she saw him across the room, chatting with some acquaintances. He was dressed simply, but his posture and the serenity in his gaze showed he had found inner balance. Laura watched him for a few minutes before summoning the courage to approach. When she did, Daniel noticed her presence and, with a respectful nod, indicated they could talk in a more private corner. They walked outside, where the noise was quieter and the light breeze blew through the trees. She began by saying she didn't intend to talk about the past itself, but rather the present. She wanted him to know there was no longer any resentment, either on his part or hers, that she understood perfectly that his life had taken a different direction. Daniel listened attentively, keeping his gaze steady. He said he appreciated her sincerity and that, indeed, he held no grudges, but that he also couldn't deny that the past had shaped the kind of relationship they could have from then on, and that this relationship, inevitably, would be one of distance. Laura took a deep breath and, for a moment, considered cutting the conversation short, but something compelled her to say that she still admired him for who he was, that she still saw him as an example of character, even though they weren't together. Daniel remained calm, but he didn't fail to emphasize that mutual admiration doesn't erase past experiences and that sometimes, loving maturely means recognizing that it's better to let the other person move on without you. These words, spoken without harshness, but with calm firmness, left Laura with a lump in her throat. The conversation, though emotionally charged, was marked by long pauses, as if each sentence needed to be measured before being spoken. Daniel spoke of how he had found peace in realizing that forgiveness was not an act for the other, but for himself, a way to avoid being trapped by resentment. Laura commented that she had also discovered that, to rebuild, one must accept the pain and not try to deny it. This exchange made them both realize that, despite all the damage, there remained an essential respect between them, something that could allow for cordial encounters in the future, even if brief and occasional. When they parted, there was a handshake that carried more than a simple polite gesture. It was the acknowledgement that they had shared something profound, something that had transformed, and, although it was no longer romantic love, it was still a story that would shape who they were. Daniel returned to the ballroom to join his friends, while Laura remained alone for a few minutes, gazing at the horizon and feeling that, somehow, that conversation had closed an inner cycle. In the following days, Daniel received a message from her thanking him for the conversation and wishing him happiness in all aspects of his life. He responded briefly but sincerely, saying he hoped the same for her. From that point on, communication became increasingly rare, not out of hostility, but because there was finally no longer any need to seek closure. What needed to be said had already been said. This new phase brought a different kind of challenge for Daniel, allowing himself to fully immerse himself in the present, without looking back. With his new partner, he began exploring places, creating small traditions, and sharing simple plans like short trips and household projects. He took special care to maintain transparency in their relationship, learning from past mistakes that weren't his, but which had shown him the importance of constant attention. He didn't want, under any circumstances, to reproduce absences that could create rifts. Laura, for her part, stepped up her volunteer activities, traveling to underprivileged communities and organizing fundraising events. Her dedication to this cause kept her busy while also restoring her sense of purpose. In conversations with close friends, she rarely mentioned Daniel, but when she did, it was a calm tone, without the heaviness or bitterness that had previously been present. Life went on, but with a kind of maturity that only arises when two people face a devastating moment together and, even apart, manage to extract something from it that transforms them. Both, unknowingly, were preparing for the final moment of this journey, one that, even without grand gestures, would forever imprint what it truly meant to have loved, lost, and learned. Autumn brought a different atmosphere to both of their lives. The dry leaves on the ground seemed to symbolize not only the end of a season, but also the definitive closure of a cycle that, however painful it had been, no longer needed to be revisited. Daniel was increasingly involved with the woman he had met, and their relationship was taking on solid shape. There was no rush, but there was consistency. The conversations were long, the silences comfortable, and little by little, he began to realize he was building something that wasn't based on comparisons with the past, but rather on a new way of looking to the future. It was different from anything he had experienced, not because it was more intense or more romantic, but because there was a new maturity, a care that came from experience and an awareness of what is truly valuable. Laura, on the other hand, continued her volunteer work routine, but deep down she knew something was still missing. It wasn't Daniel, it wasn't the life she'd lost, but a greater sense of belonging. One day, she received an invitation to coordinate a project in another region, which would require a temporary relocation. She accepted without hesitation. She knew this would be an important step in leaving behind any vestiges of life that tied her to the same place and the memories that still insisted on infiltrating her mind. The trip, which would last a few months, represented a true new beginning, without the streets, faces, and habits that constantly reminded her of what she'd lost. Before leaving, Laura decided to do something she'd been holding inside for a long time: write a letter to Daniel. It wasn't a request for anything, but a sincere account of how she saw everything now. She spoke of how she had come to understand the weight of her own choices, how she had learned that trust isn't a gift, but rather a gift built day by day. She acknowledged that, no matter how hard she tried, she could never undo what had happened, but that she hoped he would know that the love he once felt was true, even if it had been destroyed by her own hands. When she finished, she placed the letter in a plain envelope and left it in his mailbox, unsigned, though she knew he would recognize the words. Daniel found the letter late that afternoon. He sat down to read it calmly, and as he progressed, he felt a mixture of melancholy and respect. There was nothing there that could change what he felt, but it was as if the words finally put an end to everything. When he finished, he put the envelope in a drawer, not as a romantic keepsake, but as a record of a chapter that, painful as it had been, had shaped who he was. He smiled slightly and headed off to a dinner he had planned with his new partner, feeling that now, more than ever, he was ready to live fully. Months passed. Laura was adapting to the new project, meeting different people, facing challenges that required focus and dedication. There were still lonely nights, moments when she involuntarily recalled details of the life she left behind, but these memories were no longer accompanied by the same sharp pain. They were more like old photographs kept in a box, which could be looked at occasionally without causing open wounds. At the same time, she began to open herself to new friendships, and even to the possibility of a new relationship, albeit unhurriedly. A year after their last significant encounter, fate had one last coincidence in store. They were both invited to a wedding of mutual friends. It was inevitable that they would see each other, but this time there was no tension. Daniel was accompanied, and Laura was alone but calm. The moment they crossed paths, they exchanged a brief but sincere greeting, like people who share mutual respect. There was no long conversation, no need to exchange more than a discreet smile. And, curiously, it was precisely this simple moment that confirmed that they were finally at peace. At the end of the night, as Daniel left the party with his wife by his side, he felt a silent gratitude for everything he had experienced, including what went wrong, as it had led him to become more attentive, more selective, and more capable of valuing what truly matters. Laura, for her part, left the party alone, but without feeling empty. On the contrary, she felt a sense that the future was open and that, even if she had lost something important, she had been given the chance to rebuild herself. Life went on. Daniel continued on his path, strengthening his new relationship and ensuring that the foundation was solid and transparent. Laura remained in the volunteer project for another year, until she decided to start her own business, combining her previous professional experience with what she had learned helping others. They never met again, but from time to time, they would hear about each other through acquaintances, always with positive news. In the end, what remained was a simple, non-negotiable truth: betrayal didn't just destroy a marriage, it also destroyed the version of themselves they once were. And yet, somehow, they found a way to move forward, each rebuilding their own story, carrying lessons that would remain with them forever. It was the price they paid for the choices they made, a steep price, but one that ensured they would never again underestimate the value of true love and the trust that sustains it. If you've followed this story thus far, leave your thoughts and opinions on these characters' fates in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following remarkable stories like this one. May this narrative serve as a reminder that betrayal destroys homes, corrodes feelings, and leaves scars that never fade. Here, we do not condone any kind of betrayal. And, above all, may it serve as a reminder that when something true is exchanged for a moment of impulse, the loss can be forever.